Can you imagine what it's like to look into the eyes of the person who brought you into this world and feel absolutely nothing but a deep emptiness? Have you ever stopped to think about what it would be like to grow up without a mother figure, without that comforting hug in difficult moments, without that voice that should calm you down when everything seemed to be falling apart? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, about maternal abandonment, about pain, about resilience, and especially about a reunion that completely changed my perspective on forgiveness, on family, and on the true meaning of teaching a lesson to someone who caused you the greatest wound of your life. My name is here today to tell a real story, a story of abandonment that happened 17 years ago when I was still just an innocent child who understood absolutely nothing about the complexities of adult life, about financial problems, about abusive relationships, or about postpartum depression. I only knew that suddenly the person who was supposed to love me unconditionally, the person who was supposed to protect me from all the evils of the world, the person who was supposed to be my safe harbor in any storm, simply disappeared from my life without any explanation, without any warning, without even a goodbye that could give me some kind of closure. Growing up with this wound, with this constant question of why I wasn't enough, why my mother chose to leave, why she preferred a life without me, shaped absolutely everything I became. Every birthday without her presence, every school event where I saw other kids being picked up by their mothers while I waited alone, every Mother's Day that felt like a knife in my chest, every moment when I needed maternal advice and had no one to turn to, all of this built a wall around my heart that seemed impenetrable, a wall made of pain, resentment, anger, and an overwhelming sadness that accompanied me throughout my entire childhood and adolescence. But something changed when I turned 17. Something inside me clicked, and I realized that I couldn't continue living with this open wound, with this unanswered question that consumed me from the inside out. I needed answers. I needed to understand what happened. I needed to look into her eyes and ask why she abandoned me, why she chose to disappear from my life, why she never came back, never called, never sent a letter, never showed any sign that she cared about what happened to the child she left behind. So I made a decision that many people around me thought was crazy, that many people said I would regret, that many people tried to discourage me from doing. I decided to find her. I decided to track her down. I decided to confront her and teach her a lesson that I had been planning in my mind for years. But what I didn't imagine, what I could never have predicted, was that this reunion would teach me a lesson instead, a lesson about life, about pain, about the stories we don't know, about the judgments we make without knowing the full context, about forgiveness and about how sometimes the people we think are villains in our story are actually just broken people trying to survive their own personal tragedies. And before we continue with this story that I know is already touching your heart, I need to ask you something really important. If this content is resonating with you, if you're curious to know what happened in this reunion, if you want to understand how this story unfolds and what lesson I'm talking about, please hit that like button right now. It helps more than you can imagine for this video to reach other people who might be going through something similar, other people who were also abandoned, other people who are also looking for answers. And if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now and activate the notification bell, because here we talk about real stories, about life, about overcoming challenges, and about topics that really matter. Also, I want to know your opinion. I want to know if you've ever been through something similar, or if you know someone who has. Leave your comment down below because your participation is essential for us to build this community together, this space where we can share our stories, our pains, and our victories without fear of being judged. I was only 5 years old when everything changed forever in my life. It was a Tuesday morning, an ordinary day that started like any other, with me waking up for school, having breakfast at the kitchen table while my mother prepared my lunchbox with that mechanical silence that I didn't know how to interpret at that age. I remember she was quieter than usual, more distant, but as a child you don't question these things. You just accept that adults have their off days, their moments of introspection that have nothing to do with you. I went to school that morning without imagining that it would be the last time I would see her face for the next 17 years of my life. When I came home in the afternoon, everything seemed wrong. From the moment I walked through the door, the house had a different energy, a heavy silence that made my stomach churn with an anxiety I couldn't name yet. My grandmother was there waiting for me, sitting on the living room couch with red eyes and a facial expression that tried to hide the devastation she was feeling inside. She called me over, sat me on her lap, and said words that I can still hear echoing in my mind to this day, words that marked the end of my childhood innocence and the beginning of a trauma that would follow me for years. "Your mother had to go away," she said, "and she won't be able to come back for a while." A while turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, months turned into years, and the truth that no one had the courage to tell me clearly became increasingly obvious with each day that passed without any news, without a phone call, without a letter, without any sign that she remembered she had a child waiting for her return. My grandmother, bless her soul, did everything she could to fill that void, to be both grandmother and mother, to give me the love and security I needed. But there are some voids that simply cannot be filled, some wounds that remain open no matter how much love you receive from other people. I grew up creating narratives in my mind to explain her absence. Maybe she was sick and couldn't contact me. Maybe she had amnesia and forgot she had a child. Maybe she was on a secret mission and would come back one day as a hero to explain everything and apologize for all the lost time. Children have this incredible ability to create fantasies that protect them from painful reality, that allow them to continue believing in a world where mothers don't simply abandon their children without a good reason, without a justification that makes sense, without at least a goodbye that could bring some kind of peace. But as I grew older, as childhood gave way to adolescence and fantasies gave way to harsh reality, I began to see the truth that everyone around me already knew but avoided talking about. My mother hadn't been kidnapped. She wasn't in a coma. She wasn't on any secret mission. She had simply chosen to leave. She had simply decided that life with me was too heavy a burden to carry. She had simply walked away and started a new life somewhere else. A life where I didn't exist. A life where she could pretend she never had a child. A life where she was free from the responsibilities and sacrifices that motherhood demands. This realization hit me like a punch to the stomach that knocked all the air out of my lungs. It was worse than the abandonment itself, because now I knew it was a choice, it was a conscious decision, it was a deliberate act of leaving me behind and never looking back. The anger that grew inside me during my teenage years was so intense that sometimes I felt like I was going to explode, like all that resentment was going to consume me from the inside out and turn me into someone bitter, someone full of hate, someone incapable of trusting anyone or forming healthy emotional bonds. Adolescence without a mother is like trying to navigate through a storm without a compass, without a map, without any reference point to tell you which direction to go. While my friends were going through typical teenage crises and could turn to their mothers for advice, for comfort, for that unconditional support that only a mother can provide, I was dealing with everything alone, figuring things out on my own, making mistakes that maybe could have been avoided if I had someone more experienced to guide me through the turbulent waters of growing up. The first time I got my period, I was at school, and I had no idea what was happening to my body. The panic I felt in that moment, the shame, the fear that something was terribly wrong with me, all of this could have been avoided if I had a mother to prepare me for this natural transition that every girl goes through. My grandmother tried her best, but she was from another generation, another time, and talking about these topics with her was awkward and uncomfortable for both of us. I ended up learning most things from friends, from the internet, from trial and error, from experiences that sometimes were traumatic because I didn't have proper guidance. School events were always torture for me. Every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every sports day where families were invited to watch their children participate, all of these became painful reminders that I was different, that I had something missing that everyone else seemed to have. I watched my classmates being picked up by their mothers, being hugged, being celebrated for their small achievements, receiving that look of pride and unconditional love that I craved so desperately but couldn't have. I learned to put on a brave face, to pretend it didn't bother me, to act like I was fine being there with just my grandmother, or sometimes alone, but inside I was dying a little bit more each time. The questions people asked were also incredibly painful. Where's your mother? Why doesn't she ever come to school events? Is she sick? Does she work too much? Is she traveling? I created so many different stories over the years, so many elaborate lies to avoid saying the simple and devastating truth that she had abandoned me, and I had no idea where she was, or if she even thought about me occasionally. Sometimes I said she was a doctor working abroad. Sometimes I said she was a flight attendant with a very busy schedule. Sometimes I just changed the subject and hoped people wouldn't insist on getting answers I didn't want to give. Dating and relationships became extremely complicated because of my abandonment issues. Every time someone got too close, every time I started developing deeper feelings for someone, My defense mechanisms kicked in, and I would sabotage the relationship before they could have the chance to leave me like my mother did. I pushed people away. I created fights over nothing. I found excuses to end things before they could really begin, all because deep down, I was terrified of being abandoned again, terrified of opening my heart and having it broken into a million pieces one more time. My grandmother noticed this pattern and tried to help me see that not everyone would leave me, that I deserved love and healthy relationships, that I couldn't let my mother's actions define my entire life and prevent me from experiencing genuine human connection. But knowing something intellectually and actually feeling it in your heart are two completely different things. The trauma was so deep, so ingrained in every fiber of my being, that overcoming it seemed like an impossible task, like trying to climb a mountain with my bare hands while carrying a heavy weight on my back. Therapy became essential during my late teenage years. My grandmother insisted I needed professional help to process everything I had been through, to develop healthy coping mechanisms, to learn how to deal with the anger and resentment that were eating me alive from the inside out. At first I resisted. I thought therapy was for crazy people. I thought I could handle everything on my own without needing to pay someone to listen to my problems, but eventually I gave in, and it was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. Turning 17 felt like a significant milestone for me, not just because I was getting closer to adulthood, but because something inside me fundamentally shifted on that birthday. I woke up that morning with a clarity I had never experienced before, with a determination that seemed to come from somewhere deep within my soul, telling me that I couldn't continue living with this unresolved chapter of my life hanging over my head like a dark cloud that blocked out all the light. I needed closure, I needed answers. I needed to confront the woman who gave birth to me and then decided I wasn't worth staying for. My therapist had been preparing me for this moment, without me even realizing it. During our sessions, she would ask questions that made me think about what I would say to my mother if I ever had the chance, what I would want to know, what would bring me peace, what would allow me to finally move forward with my life without this weight constantly pulling me down. At first, these hypothetical conversations felt pointless because I never imagined I would actually find her. I never thought I would have the courage to go looking for someone who clearly didn't want to be found by me. But on my 17th birthday, something changed. Maybe it was becoming older and more mature. Maybe it was years of therapy finally paying off. Maybe it was the realization that I would soon be an adult and I didn't want to carry this baggage into the next phase of my life. Or maybe it was simply that I had reached my breaking point and couldn't take one more day of not knowing why she left, where she was, if she ever thought about me, if she ever regretted her decision, if she ever wondered what kind of person I became without her. I told my grandmother about my decision, and I could see the fear in her eyes immediately. She was terrified that finding my mother would hurt me even more, that confronting her would open old wounds that were just starting to heal, that the answers I was looking for might be worse than living with the questions. She begged me to reconsider, to wait a few more years, to think about what I was doing and whether it was really worth the emotional risk. But my mind was made up, and nothing she said could change my determination to see this through. The truth is, I had been thinking about this for years, planning it in my mind during those sleepless nights when the pain of abandonment felt so overwhelming that I could barely breathe. I had imagined countless scenarios of how our reunion would go, what I would say to her, how I would make her understand the magnitude of the pain she caused me, how I would teach her a lesson about the consequences of abandoning your own child. Some of these fantasies were angry and vindictive, full of accusations and harsh words designed to hurt her the way she hurt me. Other fantasies were more controlled, more dignified, where I would calmly explain how her actions affected me and then walk away without giving her the satisfaction of seeing me break down. But underneath all these different scenarios, underneath all the anger and resentment and pain, there was something else, something I was almost ashamed to admit even to myself. There was still a small part of me, that inner child who never really grew up, who hoped that maybe there was a good explanation for everything. Maybe there were circumstances I didn't know about. Maybe she had been forced to leave against her will. Maybe she had been looking for me all these years, just like I was about to start looking for her. This tiny spark of hope was both a blessing and a curse, because it meant I hadn't completely given up on the possibility of having a mother, but it also meant I was setting myself up for potential disappointment that could destroy me. My grandmother eventually realized she couldn't talk me out of this decision, so instead she decided to help me. She sat me down one evening and told me everything she knew about my mother, information she had been protecting me from for years, details about her life before and after she left, pieces of the puzzle that helped me understand the full picture of who this woman really was. Some of what she told me made me even angrier, but some of it also made me see my mother as a real person with flaws and struggles, rather than just the villain I had built up in my mind. What would you do in my situation? If the person who was supposed to love you unconditionally abandoned you without explanation, would you go looking for them, or would you let them stay in the past where they belong? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I really want to know how you would handle this kind of situation. Finding someone who doesn't want to be found in the digital age is both easier and harder than you might think. On one hand, we have social media, public records, search engines, and countless online tools that can help track down almost anyone if you know where to look and how to use these resources effectively. On the other hand, people who genuinely want to disappear can do so quite successfully by staying off social media, using different names, moving frequently, and leaving very few digital footprints behind for anyone to follow. I started my search the way most people in my generation would, by typing her name into every social media platform I could think of: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, even MySpace, just in case she was one of those people who created an account years ago and forgot about it. I spent hours scrolling through profiles of women with the same name, looking at photos and trying to determine if any of these strangers could possibly be my mother. Every profile that matched her age and general description made my heart race with anxiety and anticipation, only to crash with disappointment when I realized it was just another person who happened to share her name. The problem was, I barely remembered what she looked like. 17 years is a long time, and I was only 5 when she left, so my memories of her face were fuzzy and unreliable, mixed up with old photographs I had seen and probably distorted by time and emotion. I had exactly 3 photos of her that my grandmother had kept, 3 frozen moments in time that showed a young woman holding a baby who didn't know yet that this woman would one day walk out of her life forever. I studied these photos obsessively, memorizing every feature, every expression, hoping that somehow I would recognize her if I saw her online or on the street. When social media searches led nowhere, I turned to more traditional methods. I contacted the Department of Motor Vehicles, hoping to find a current address through license records. I searched property tax databases to see if she owned any real estate under her name. I even hired a private investigator for a brief period, spending money I had saved from part-time jobs and birthday gifts over the years, money I had been planning to use for college, but decided this was more important. This was necessary for my mental health and future happiness. The private investigator was a middle-aged man named Robert, who had been doing this kind of work for over 20 years. He listened to my story with a neutral expression that never betrayed judgment, taking notes and asking questions about my mother's last known location, her full name, her date of birth, the names of any relatives or friends she might have stayed in contact with, any hobbies or interests that might give clues about where she could be now. I answered everything I could with the limited information I had, feeling simultaneously hopeful that he could find her and terrified about what would happen when he did. 3 weeks later, Robert called me with news. He had found her living in a small town about 200 miles away, working as a waitress at a local diner, living in a modest apartment with apparently no husband and no other children. The information felt surreal, like suddenly this abstract concept of my missing mother became a real person with a real address and a real life that had been happening all this time parallel to mine, but completely separate from it. I asked him if he was absolutely certain it was her, and he said he was 99% sure based on the information he had verified, including her social security number and date of birth. Now I had to decide what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to drive there immediately, to show up at her workplace unannounced and confront her in front of customers and co-workers, to make her feel exposed and uncomfortable the way she made me feel my entire life. Another part of me wanted to write her a letter first, to give her a chance to prepare for our meeting, to let her know I was coming and why, to give her the opportunity to explain herself before I passed judgment. A third part of me wanted to just show up at her apartment, to see where she lived, to understand what kind of life she had built for herself without me in it. I decided on a direct approach. I would drive to her town, go to the diner where she worked, sit in her section and wait for her to take my order. I wanted to see if she would recognize me, if 17 years had erased my face from her memory completely, or if there would be some flicker of recognition, some maternal instinct that would tell her this customer was actually her abandoned child, coming back to demand answers and deliver the lesson she deserved. Think about how you would prepare for a moment like this. What would you wear? What would you say? How would you keep your emotions under control when facing the person who caused you the deepest pain of your life? This is what I was dealing with as I planned every detail of our reunion. The drive to her town took exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes, but it felt like both an eternity and a split second at the same time. Every mile brought me closer to a moment I had been imagining for years, a confrontation I had rehearsed in my mind thousands of times, playing out different scenarios and different outcomes, preparing myself for every possible reaction she might have. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I had to pull over twice because my anxiety was so overwhelming that I thought I might have a panic attack right there on the highway. I arrived at the diner around 2 in the afternoon, a time I had specifically chosen, because I figured it would be past the lunch rush, but before the dinner crowd started coming in, giving us more privacy for the conversation I was planning to force upon her, whether she wanted it or not. The diner was exactly what you would expect from a small-town restaurant, with red vinyl booths, checkered floors, a long counter with spinning stools, and the smell of coffee and fried food permeating the air. It was the kind of place where everyone probably knew everyone else, and a stranger walking in would immediately attract attention and curiosity. I sat in a booth near the window and waited with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Several minutes passed before she emerged from the kitchen carrying plates of food for another table, and when I saw her for the first time in 17 years, I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. She looked older, obviously, more tired, with lines around her eyes and grey streaks in her hair that she hadn't bothered to dye, but it was unmistakably her, the woman from those 3 photographs I had studied obsessively, the woman who had haunted my dreams and nightmares for almost 2 decades. She moved through the diner with efficiency, born from years of waitressing, smiling at customers with a practiced friendliness that never quite reached her eyes, refilling coffee cups and taking orders with the kind of automatic politeness that service industry workers develop to get through long shifts. She hadn't noticed me yet sitting there in my booth, hadn't looked in my direction, hadn't felt the intense stare I was directing at her, with all the mixed emotions churning inside me like a storm that was about to break loose and destroy everything in its path. When she finally came to my table holding a notepad and pen ready to take my order, our eyes met, and I watched her face carefully for any sign of recognition, any indication that she knew who I was, any maternal instinct that might tell her this customer was someone significant. But there was nothing, just the same polite smile she gave everyone else, the same rehearsed greeting asking what I wanted to drink, and if I needed a few minutes to look at the menu. She didn't recognize me at all, didn't see any resemblance to the 5-year-old child she had left behind, didn't feel any connection to the teenager sitting in front of her. The moment I had been planning for so long was finally here, but suddenly I couldn't speak. All the angry speeches I had prepared, all the accusations and questions and demands for explanation, everything vanished from my mind, and I just sat there staring at her like an idiot while she waited patiently for me to say something. She probably thought I was just shy or socially awkward. Not that I was her abandoned child gathering the courage to reveal my identity and confront her about the worst decision she ever made. Finally, I managed to speak, and the words that came out were not at all what I had planned. Instead of the angry confrontation I had rehearsed, instead of immediately revealing who I was and watching her reaction, I simply ordered a coffee and told her I needed a few more minutes with the menu. She smiled and walked away, and I was left sitting there feeling like a coward, feeling like I had already failed at this mission I had driven 3 hours and 47 minutes to accomplish. But as I watched her interact with other customers, as I observed her from a distance and tried to understand who this person really was beyond the villain I had built up in my mind, something shifted inside me. The anger that had sustained me for so long, that had fueled my determination to find her and teach her a lesson, started to crack around the edges as I noticed things I hadn't expected to see. The sadness in her eyes that she couldn't quite hide behind the fake smile, the exhaustion in the way she moved, like someone carrying a heavy burden, the loneliness that seemed to radiate from her, despite being surrounded by people all day long. When she came back to take my order, I made my decision. I looked directly into her eyes and said very calmly, "Do you know who I am?" The confusion on her face was genuine as she studied me more carefully, trying to figure out if I was someone she should remember, a former classmate or neighbor or distant relative she had forgotten about. I watched understanding dawn slowly, watched her face go pale as recognition finally kicked in, watched her hands start trembling so badly that she dropped her notepad and pen on the floor. The notepad and pen hitting the floor created a sound that seemed impossibly loud in that moment, drawing the attention of other customers who glanced over with mild curiosity before returning to their meals and conversations. My mother stood frozen in place, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between shock and fear and pain, and maybe a hint of something that could have been relief. Her mouth opened and closed several times like she was trying to speak, but couldn't find any words adequate for this situation. Couldn't figure out what to say to the child she had abandoned 17 years ago, who had somehow tracked her down and showed up at her workplace. I had imagined this moment going so many different ways. In some versions I was cold and calculated, delivering my rehearsed speech about the pain she caused me with perfect composure, and then walking out before she could respond, leaving her with the same confusion and abandonment she had left me with. In other versions I was angry and loud, making a scene in front of everyone, ensuring that her co-workers and customers all knew what kind of person she really was, what kind of mother abandons their 5-year-old child without explanation or remorse. In still other versions, I broke down crying and demanded to know why I wasn't good enough, why she couldn't love me, what was so wrong with me that she had to completely erase me from her life. But none of those scenarios matched what actually happened. Instead of anger or tears or cold calculation, I felt something unexpected wash over me as I looked at this broken woman in a waitress uniform who was clearly struggling to keep herself together in front of her customers. I felt something that I never thought I would feel toward her, something that took me completely by surprise and changed the entire trajectory of this confrontation I had been planning for so long. I felt pity, genuine heartbreaking pity for someone who looked like they had been punished by life far more severely than any lesson I could teach them. She finally found her voice and whispered my name like a question, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to say it out loud, like maybe speaking my name would make this nightmare real, and she would have to face the consequences of her actions instead of continuing to live in whatever fantasy world she had created, where she could pretend I didn't exist. I nodded confirmation and watched tears start rolling down her face, watched her struggle to maintain her composure in front of customers who were definitely noticing now that something dramatic was happening in their small-town diner. Her manager, an older woman with kind eyes, came over and asked if everything was okay. My mother shook her head and said she needed to take her break right now, her voice breaking on the last word, as she turned and walked quickly toward the back of the diner without looking at me again. The manager looked at me with concern, and I realized she was probably trying to protect her employee from what she assumed was some kind of harassment or threatening situation. I assured her that everything was fine and asked if I could speak with my mother privately, emphasizing the word mother so she would understand this was a family situation, not a dangerous stranger situation. We ended up in a small break room behind the kitchen that smelled like cigarettes and old coffee, sitting across from each other at a plastic table that had seen better days. The awkward silence stretched between us for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. I had driven all this way to teach her a lesson, to make her understand what she had done to me, to force her to acknowledge the pain and damage her abandonment had caused. I had prepared speeches and accusations and questions that I had been carrying around in my heart for 17 years, waiting for this moment when I could finally unload all of it on her and watch her suffer the way I had suffered. But looking at her now, really seeing her for the first time, I realized that she was already suffering. Whatever life she had been living for the past 17 years, it clearly hadn't been the happy, carefree existence I had sometimes imagined when my anger was at its peak. This wasn't someone who had abandoned her child and then went on to live a wonderful, fulfilling life full of joy and success and new opportunities. This was someone who looked haunted by ghosts, weighed down by regrets, existing rather than truly living, going through the motions of daily life without any real spark or happiness or hope for something better. The lesson I had come to teach her suddenly felt cruel and unnecessary. She didn't need me to tell her that abandoning her child was wrong. She clearly already knew that. She didn't need me to make her feel guilty or ashamed. Those emotions were already written all over her face and embedded in every defeated line of her body language. She didn't need me to punish her for her mistakes because life had apparently already done that job far more thoroughly than I ever could. So instead of the angry confrontation I had planned, instead of the cold, calculated revenge I had fantasized about, I simply asked the question that had been haunting me for 17 years. Why did you leave me? And in that moment I realized that maybe the real lesson wasn't for her at all. Maybe the real lesson was for me to learn that sometimes the answers we seek don't actually bring the closure we think they will, and sometimes forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook for their mistakes, but about freeing yourself from the burden of carrying around all that anger and pain. Have you ever planned something for years only to have it go completely differently than you imagined when the moment finally arrived? Share your experiences in the comments. Her answer, when it finally came, wasn't what I expected at all. I had prepared myself for excuses, for justifications, for explanations that would ultimately be unsatisfying, because nothing could really justify abandoning your child. I had prepared myself for her to blame my father, to claim she had been forced to leave, to say she had always planned to come back, but circumstances prevented it. I had even prepared myself for the possibility that she would say she simply didn't want to be a mother, that she had made a mistake having me, and decided to correct that mistake by disappearing from my life. But instead she told me a story that I had never heard before, a story that my grandmother either didn't know or had chosen to keep from me to protect her daughter's privacy, even after everything that had happened. She told me about her struggles with severe postpartum depression and psychosis that had started shortly after I was born, about hallucinations and paranoid delusions that made her believe she was going to hurt me, about the overwhelming terror she felt every time she was alone with me, because her mind was telling her to do things that horrified her, things that no mother should ever think about doing to their child. She described days when she couldn't get out of bed, when the thought of taking care of an infant felt as impossible as climbing Mount Everest, when she looked at me crying in my crib and felt absolutely nothing except exhaustion and resentment and fear. She talked about the shame she felt admitting these thoughts to anyone, about the stigma surrounding mental health, especially for new mothers who are supposed to be glowing with happiness and maternal love, about how she tried to push through it and pretend everything was fine, until one day she realized she couldn't pretend anymore, because she was becoming genuinely dangerous to me. The day she left wasn't a cold, calculated decision to abandon her responsibilities and start a new life. It was a desperate act of what she considered protection, removing herself from my life before she could act on the dark thoughts that were consuming her mind and potentially harm the child she had created. She didn't go to my grandmother because she was too ashamed to admit what she was thinking and feeling, too afraid that everyone would judge her as a monster, too convinced that she was broken beyond repair and didn't deserve to be anyone's mother. She checked herself into a psychiatric hospital that day, staying there for 3 months, while doctors tried to find the right combination of medications and therapy to stabilize her mental health. When she was finally released, she was terrified to come back, terrified that seeing me would trigger the psychosis again, terrified that everyone would hate her for what she had done, terrified that she had already caused irreparable damage and her presence would only make things worse. So she stayed away, telling herself it was better for me to grow up thinking she was simply gone, rather than knowing the truth about her mental illness and the dark thoughts she had experienced. Years passed, and the distance between us grew into an impossible chasm she didn't know how to cross. She thought about reaching out countless times, writing letters she never sent, picking up the phone and then hanging up before anyone answered, driving to our town and then turning around before she reached our house. The guilt and shame became a prison she couldn't escape from, keeping her trapped in a life of isolation and regret, working dead-end jobs in small towns where nobody knew her history, avoiding relationships because she felt she didn't deserve happiness or connection or forgiveness for what she had done. She told me all of this through tears, her voice breaking repeatedly as she relived the worst period of her life, apologizing over and over again for the pain she had caused me, for the years we lost, for not being strong enough to get help sooner, or brave enough to try to come back and explain everything. She said she understood if I hated her, that she hated herself for what she had done, that there was no excuse that could make up for abandoning a 5-year-old child, regardless of the circumstances surrounding that decision. I sat there trying to process everything she was telling me, trying to reconcile this story with the narrative I had been carrying around for 17 years. The villain in my story suddenly became a deeply traumatized person who had made an impossible choice while suffering from a severe mental illness, someone who had punished themselves far more harshly than I ever could, someone who had been living in her own personal hell of guilt and regret and isolation for almost 2 decades. Part of me was angry that nobody had told me the truth, that I had spent all these years believing I was abandoned because I wasn't good enough, when the reality was much more complicated and had very little to do with me personally. Part of me was sad for everything we both lost, for the relationship we could have had if she had gotten help sooner, or if the stigma around mental health had been less severe back then, or if someone had intervened and helped us reconnect before so many years had passed. Part of me was relieved to finally understand why she left, to know that it wasn't because I was unlovable or not worth staying for, to realize that her leaving was about her own struggles and limitations, rather than any deficiency in me. But mostly I just felt tired, exhausted from carrying around all this anger and pain for so long, worn out from the emotional roller coaster of finding her and confronting her and hearing her story. The lesson I had come to teach her had transformed into a lesson for both of us about the complexity of human experience, about how mental illness can destroy lives and families, about how shame and stigma prevent people from getting help and making amends, about how the stories we tell ourselves are often incomplete versions of much more complicated truths. What revelations in your life have completely changed your perspective on a person or situation you thought you understood? I'd love to hear your stories. We sat in that break room for over an hour talking about everything, about her mental health journey since that day she left, about my life growing up without her, about the grandmother who raised me and passed away 2 years ago without ever knowing I would find her daughter and hear the full story. We talked about therapy and medications and the progress she had made in managing her mental illness, about the ways postpartum depression and psychosis are better understood now than they were 17 years ago, but still carry so much stigma that many women suffer in silence rather than seeking help. She asked me about school, about my interests, about who I had become in all the years she missed. I told her about the abandonment issues I struggled with, about the trust problems that affected my relationships, about the therapy that helped me process my trauma and develop healthier coping mechanisms. I showed her pictures on my phone of my life, of my friends, of my grandmother in the last years of her life, filling in all the blank spaces of the years we lost, creating a bridge between the 5-year-old she remembered and the 17-year-old sitting across from her now. The question of what happens next hung in the air between us unspoken for a while. I didn't know if I wanted her back in my life in any meaningful way, didn't know if I could trust her not to disappear again if things got difficult, didn't know if rebuilding a relationship was even possible after so much time and pain and distance. She didn't ask for anything, didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation, made it clear that she understood if I wanted to leave and never see her again, that simply getting the chance to apologize and explain had been more than she thought she deserved. But here's what I realized sitting in that dingy break room smelling like cigarettes and old coffee. The lesson I came to teach her about abandonment and pain and consequences had transformed into something completely different, into a lesson about compassion and understanding and the complexity of human experience. She didn't need me to tell her that abandoning her child was wrong. She had been living with that knowledge and guilt every single day for 17 years. What she needed, what we both needed, was to see each other as real complicated human beings rather than the simplified versions we had been carrying around in our minds. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that we instantly became best friends, or that everything is perfect now between us. Healing from this kind of trauma doesn't happen in one emotional conversation in a diner break room. We're taking things slowly, talking on the phone occasionally, meeting for coffee every few weeks, trying to build something new, rather than trying to recreate the mother-daughter relationship we never had. Some days are easier than others, and sometimes the old anger and resentment come back when I think about all the years we lost and all the pain I experienced growing up without her. But I've also learned that holding on to anger doesn't hurt the person you're angry at nearly as much as it hurts you. Carrying around resentment and bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It only destroys you from the inside, while they continue living their life unaffected by your feelings. Forgiveness isn't about saying what someone did was okay or erasing the harm they caused. It's about releasing yourself from the burden of carrying around all that negative energy and making space for healing and growth and peace. The real lesson from all of this isn't about teaching anyone anything. It's about learning to see situations from multiple perspectives, about understanding that people's actions often have complex reasons behind them that we don't immediately understand, about recognizing that someone can cause us tremendous pain without being a monster, about accepting that life is messy and complicated and rarely fits into the neat narratives of heroes and villains that we try to create. If there's anything I want you to take away from my story, it's this. Whatever pain you're carrying from your past, whatever grudges you're holding on to, whatever lessons you think you need to teach someone who hurt you, consider whether that anger is serving you or just weighing you down. Consider whether understanding and compassion might bring you more peace than revenge ever could. Consider whether the person who hurt you might be carrying their own pain and guilt that has already punished them more than you ever could. My mother and I still have a long journey ahead of us, and I don't know exactly where it will lead. Maybe we'll develop a close relationship. Maybe we'll remain distant acquaintances who talk occasionally. Maybe something will happen that causes me to cut contact completely. I'm leaving myself open to all possibilities without expectations or demands, just taking it one day at a time and being honest about my feelings and boundaries. The 17-year-old version of me who drove to that diner expecting to deliver a harsh lesson walked out a different person, someone who learned that the most important lessons are often the ones we don't plan to learn, the ones that challenge our assumptions and force us to grow beyond our anger and pain into something more compassionate and understanding. And maybe that's the real lesson of this entire story, that sometimes the journey we think we're on leads us somewhere completely unexpected, but exactly where we needed to go. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community where we can share our experiences and support each other through life's challenges. If this video resonated with you, or if you have your own story about abandonment, forgiveness, or complicated family relationships, please share it in the comments below because your voice matters and your experience might help someone else who is going through something similar. Don't forget to like this video if it touched your heart and subscribe to the channel for more real stories about overcoming adversity and finding healing. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember that your past doesn't have to define your future.